from the top down, we must be inclusive.
You have to be loud. You have to be different. The audiences are demanding it.
Good afternoon and evening, and I am really so honored to be part of this conversation with such a distinguished group of experts. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this month's STARS Take the Lead Transparency Talk. STARS has hosted these talks since April of 2021, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to their first live event. Now, today's panel and topic will focus on how companies are thriving by expanding their markets to include historically excluded consumers and how focusing on representation is changing the global landscape. On a personal note, I come to this conversation with a particular passion for the topic, given the work that I do with Bloomberg New Voices, which is our commitment to amplify the views and perspectives of female experts and other underrepresented executives working in the financial industry on our many media platforms. One piece of housekeeping for our virtual audience that are watching right now, please enter your questions into the chat, and for our live audience, we'll make time for a few questions from you later on. And now I'd like to introduce a truly distinguished panel. First to my right, Nadja Bellin-White, the Global Chief Marketing Officer for Vice Media Group, where she leads the company's brand storytelling efforts globally. Next to her is Ana Distasi, Senior Vice President and Head of Latin American Art for Sotheby's. She secures key consignments, develops emerging markets, and manages client relationships throughout the US and abroad. Then we have Sheldon Lin, a partner at Southern California McKinsey & Company, where he co-leads the firm's revenue growth management practice globally. Christina Norman is head of content for Think 450, which is referred to as the innovation engine of the NBA Players Association, where she oversees all original content. And finally, Nicola Grant, Senior Vice President of Consumer and Brand Marketing at MasterCard, with 20 plus years in international marketing. She is responsible for all consumer-facing brand and marketing initiatives across the US, which includes programs that support MasterCard goals and commitments for gender and racial equity. So, very impressive. Thanks for joining us. Now let's start our discussion. Today we want to talk about how companies are expanding their market shares and growing their consumer base through cultural inclusion and by addressing the buying power of historically underrepresented groups. So I want to begin by asking all of you one question. We'll go through each panelist. First with you, Nadja. How has this push for diversity and expanding markets informed day-to-day operations at Vice Media and content produced by your company? And specifically, I want to see if you could focus a bit on how do you make sure that there is inclusive conversations happening and coming up with your initiatives?
So thank you so much for that gracious introduction. For me, it's about representation in the room, behind the camera, where you have writers, directors, creators. They all need to be represented. And you need to be quite deliberate in ensuring that you have just that. And I think oftentimes, and we were just talking about it earlier, the loudest person in the room takes up all the space and all the hot air. But sometimes you have to listen to the quiet voices, the voices that might not always be heard, the divergent voices, to make sure their point of view is part of the storytelling. And for me, and certainly my team at Vice, it's something that we do each and every day, not just in the United States, but around the world.
And you talk a bit about curating the conversation. It's not only who's in the room, but who you don't think should be in the room.
Exactly, and I think that what I try to do is oftentimes the person that raises their hand is like, I should be there, and I'm like, actually, no. The person that should be there is that person over there, or that person over there, or you. I know you think that you're younger than everybody else, but quite frankly, none of us are the target audience, so I want to hear from you. And I think as leaders, it is incumbent upon you to make an effort to say, no, everybody else quiet down. I need to hear this particular person's point of view. Tell me why you think we should be doing this. Tell me why you think our client target should be doing this. Tell them. And I wish I had that in my career. I didn't always have it, but I try to make an effort to make sure that the people, not just around the table, but who should be, are able to come in and have a voice and feel comfortable raising it.
Excellent. Anna, how does this play out in your company?
Well, it's a very different setting. Sotheby's, as you may know, it's an auction house. We specialize, in auctions and private sales. So for us, we are not content-oriented necessarily. That is not the end product that we put together. But for me, it's more about who those people within Sotheby's, the specialists, the people in marketing that we, anyone that we work with, how do those voices truly reflect what the country is about today? Some people may think in the past, Sotheby's and all of these high-end businesses, they were elitist and they were very much focused on a particular demographic. And with more than 20 years in this business, I can tell you that I have seen a change, and I have seen how Sotheby's is really more inclined and more open, and they truly have a strategy to recruit at all levels, people from different backgrounds, the future specialists in 10, 20 years, those people that will be making the decisions as to what to consign and what to sell and who to go to and how to put these sales together and how to approach our new clients. I think it's from within, the new generation of kids that are graduating and who want to join the art world that come from all different backgrounds, not traditionally what has been in the past. That's where it starts, from within, and then it trickles down into everything that we do as a company.
Excellent, thank you. Sheldon, at McKinsey, what have you observing in your work in terms of this issue?
Yeah, first I'll just say thank you for having me. Great to be here. And for those who don't know, McKinsey is a management consultancy, so I'll speak a bit about how this shows up in our client service.
Yep.
And we would say, of course, it's great for harmony, and we all saw from COVID-19 that we have a shared destiny. But we try to frame this as an economic opportunity. And we talk about this idea of sustainable, inclusive growth. And the reality is that, just to pick on one particular population, Black consumers represent an incremental 300 billion with a B, of consumption potential, because they're currently underserved by, for example, the quality of the offerings, by, for example, the experience they have in stores. So to the extent that brands, to include brands in media, want to access that economic potential, part of the solution is who are the people making those decisions. So today, just to put a number out there, fewer than 5% of all the people who work in market research are Black. Keep in mind, the Black population makes up 13% or 40% of the overall. So again, to the extent empathy can only take you so far, the people making these decisions need to look like the folks they're trying to serve. So we try to manifest this in how we serve clients, and we start with a perspective around not just the moral imperative, but also the economic opportunity.
So just practically speaking, when we talk about 5%, even if these people are in the room, and we talk about this a lot with female representation, we have a voice, but we don't have a vote. Mm-hmm. How do you ensure that as you're increasing and improving representation in the company, that the underrepresented have a vote?
Yeah, the reality is that until, to my mind, proof of progress, there will be some indicators. Ultimately, when the makeup of the folks who are making decisions on who gets hired, who gets promoted, what projects get funded, look like the population, we're not there yet. So we can, with empathy, have a perspective that starts to bridge the divide. But in my mind, you will never bridge the divide completely unless the folks who are deciding look like the people for whom they're deciding.
Thank you. Christina.
I'm a content creator, and I work inside of a labor union, which is a little bit of a dissonance in some ways. So the main job of the union is to represent the interests of the players, to negotiate for them, to make sure that they've got, if they have grievances, that's what the union's for. I always say there's not a player in the world who wakes up in the morning and says, I have a great creative idea, I'm going to call the union. So it's been, and on top of that, 80% of the players in the league are African American. The other 20% of them are from, many other countries. So diversity is kind of baked in many ways, and it needs to be. So when I approach it from a storytelling perspective, as Nadja said, it's definitely about who's in the room, whose stories are we telling. And I really see this for me as an opportunity to shed a lot of light on all sorts of different stories. I mean, there's 450 players in the union. Every single one of them has a different story and a different path to how they got there. And I think it's, the most important thing that we can do from a storytelling perspective is see the humanity in someone else. So I think that we have that opportunity, and in some of the content that I create, especially we've got a big kids initiative, which I'm so passionate about, because I feel like the values of the game, cooperation, teamwork, dedication, hard work, all of those things. What parent doesn't want those values? So, and when you get to see those in Black families, when you get to see Black fathers, when you get to see intact Black families, that starts to change your perception of what normal is. So it's less about a push for diversity than it is about a reflection of an incredibly multifaceted reality.
That's so interesting. Thank you. And Nicola.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me. I think we're already touching on the economic opportunity, but when you consider that half the world's adults don't have access to any form of bank account, that starts to bring home the opportunity globally that exists for society. And so MasterCard very much comes from a position of driving inclusion in the financial system. And that's important from our perspective because it anchors our business to real reason for driving purpose and change. Because you need to be able to drive economic gain as an organization, as a business, whilst you drive positive change. And I think this is really interesting. So then when you look at what the impact of that is on the design of our organization to affect that change, we have very good processes in place that look at the underrepresented groups and then build infrastructure around ensuring that they're nurtured and grown from the inside so that we can positively affect the outside. But we certainly haven't found a way to do that inside on your own. So we typically have a framework which covers 3 pillars: people, society, and market. People is all about the nurturing of the talent that you have and providing equal opportunity and nurturing the next generation of talent that is going to come through into the organization. Then there's society, which is partnering with organizations who have expertise in the spaces that you want to grow and learn and build and develop in, which is really critical for informing outside of the organization. And then market is where we focus on product design. We understand what people need and how we would build things differently. So those are the 3 pillars that we apply to every circumstance.
I mean, how would you respond to some of the things that Sheldon said about the decision-making process? What has shifted within MasterCard?
Yeah, I mean, we have goals in place. You can't drive change just by sitting back and hoping that it will happen. And I'm on our global gender steerco for the organization, and we had an interesting conversation with our vice chair, who also happens to sit on the 30% club as chairman, which is getting women onto boards. And she said, if your goal to drive women into the top leadership positions in this organization is a 50-50 split, then you're falling way short. You need to be striving for hiring 70% of women into those roles so you can pull them through and drive to a position of equity. And so those goals and being held accountable to driving change is really important to focus everyone.
Thank you, and I want to now expand on the accountability question. Nadja, you're known in the industry as a fixer for brands that face challenges in their growth and expansion into diverse markets. So what are some of the approaches that you use to aid brands in their missions, and what is your advice on how to hold managers, executives accountable for doing this right?
Where number one, you have to listen carefully. And number two, to build on Sheldon's point, I lead with the data. Because the data doesn't lie. And you have to show what the value is of the audience. You know, oftentimes I'm having conversations about, let's say you're talking about the value of the young African-American female consumer for our unbothered vertical. One of the ways I talk about the value of this audience is how highly educated this audience is, you know, how influential this audience is, what their buying power is. And I'm talking about the broader representation of Gen Z. You're talking about 350 billion worldwide. The numbers don't lie. And oftentimes, when I often get pushback saying, oh, that can't really be true, I say, with all due respect, you're not the target. Last I checked, you're not the target. How about you listen sometimes? And my perspective, particularly with brands I work with, is I'm not here to give you a lot of rhetoric. I'm here to tell you the truth. Do you want to listen to the truth? Do you want to really engage? Or are you just simply spouting what you think the press wants you to hear? And oftentimes when you're able to break it down in that kind of fact, either I'll get a call back or I won't. But you know, I think what we have to be careful about is, and we talked about it briefly this morning, there are a lot of people that talk about DEI, that talk about representation. I'm so happy to hear what Nicola is saying. Very few actually follow through with it. Once the cameras go away and the reporters go away and people leave the room, the question is, who's really representing you? Is there true parity and equity? Are you really going to target the audience in the way that they should? Or are you going to do it in a way that mirrors cultural appropriation? So I take it very seriously. I try to come to the room with the facts, the data, with the listening, and say, do you want to be a partner on this journey? And I can tell you, for a brand like Target, they actually have been. Others, not so much.
I was going to ask if for your reputation
I won't talk
as
about
the
the
fixer,
others.
Can you give a positive example of being the fixer?
Oh, geez. There's so many good examples of being a fixer, or perhaps using the data to shed light, and the great work when I was at Ogilvy that I did with Dove, or the great work that we're doing with Target. And when Target came to us, they were like, look, we can do a better job reaching young African-American female consumers. I love the fact they owned it. More importantly, in working with them, we are pairing them up with influencers like Tabitha Brown and others to help them connect to their audiences. That's a great, but they follow it all the way through. I am merely a facilitator in this. Target has to own that relationship. And that's the thing about, if you're working in the media or agency services business or consulting, you can only advise. But it's the onus is on the brands to actually take that torch and lead it all the way through. Some do it, and some don't.
So Sheldon, talking about data, I think it would be helpful if you could tell us a little bit about what the data is showing us. And I think perhaps the best focus for us right now would be your focus on Black representation in the film industry. I know you just come out with a very interesting report. What is the data showing us, and how much progress has been made?
Great. Thank you. So for quick background, about a year and a half or so ago, we did a report called Black Representation in Film and TV. And I'll spare the full journey, but that report consisted of a series of qualitative interviews, discussions with professionals trying to build a career in Hollywood. And it spanned the full spectrum. So on-screen, off-screen, executives, people who are trying to be agents, management talent, etc. And we also looked at data over a pretty long period of time to understand things like funding levels versus performance at box office. And the net of it, I'll hit a few big points. We found that specifically to the experience that Black folks had in trying to build this career, there were over 40 different pain points, to include things like how they actually entered in the first place, getting an internship, one that pays such that they can actually take care of themselves and their families. It included getting access to an agent and the chicken and egg problem of studios not looking for black talent, therefore agencies not putting a roster of black talent, and vice versa. To include how projects get optioned, the time lag between an option and a production, and the fact that many black folks are not from a background allows them to go 2, 3, 4 years without a job. To include a perspective on what stories black professionals can tell. Trauma, poverty, that sounds good. Imagine the next Game of Thrones, less so. To include things like more routine indignities, light, hair and makeup on set. To include access to networks that can assemble a production crew. To include a view on what projects can be sold where. The valuation of your product. So we found, again, I won't list all 40, but over 40 different pain points. And what was interesting, we spoke to lots of folks who had made it and who were not black. And I remember one particular interview that was quite poignant, was somebody who was white male, and he said, look, let's face it, I got this job because I went to Princeton. And the person who hired me sent an email to the arts clubs at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford. And the person said, congrats, you have the job, but guess what? It's an unpaid internship. And that was somebody who was, I assume, quite well-intentioned. But first, in the schools the emails went to. Second, in the offer of an unpaid internship, a whole swath of the population excluded right off the bat. And ultimately, we found that from an economic perspective, to come back to that lens, if the barriers that black folks in particular, and this applies to other minorities to be clear, face in film and TV were to come down, the industry could realize an extra $10 billion a year in revenues. And that's from taking away 3 sources of market inefficiencies. One is supply of talent. So black creators, when you do the math, only account for about 4% of all projects. I'm talking about people who are producers, creators, writers, directors. When it comes to funding, the average black project, normalizing for genre, gets 30 to 40% less in production and marketing budget, even though they deliver 16 cents more per dollar spent. When it comes to distribution, the average black-led project is seen in 30 to 40% fewer countries. So again, from a purely economic perspective, if you took down those friction points, you could unleash $10 billion of incremental revenue for the entire industry to enjoy. Now, why aren't we there? That's a more complicated discussion. So, but again, pretty compelling when it comes to the qualitative components, the facts, and then the economic opportunity available if people would pursue this. And I would say one last thing, just to be clear about the difficulty in solving these problems. We're talking about literally decades, centuries, in some cases, of structural issues that surface in this fashion. And Jeffrey is here, Jeffrey Hirsch is here. The reality is that Hollywood is not a company, it's an ecosystem. So in any given company, and great what Starz is doing here, you could solve a lot of problems, but your talent has an agent, has a manager, is interacting with award shows, is trying to pitch projects elsewhere. So until the whole ecosystem is resolved, you actually won't get to the progress that you would like, and certainly not achieve the extra $10 billion in value that's available.
We're going to come back to that, because what I want to get at is what are some of the faster changes that can happen, because some of the things that you've brought up, having more discipline, having certain changes in the approach could get quick wins rather than waiting another how many decades? Yes. Let me turn to Nicola now. Consumers look at brands' values when they are considering where to shop increasingly. Sponsorship is part of your brand strategy, and you've said in the past that as brand strategies evolve as you understand people's passions. How has this helped expand MasterCard's footprint and impact, and how do you measure success?
In 450 feet.
That's how you do it.
She's got it.
Sorry about that.
Oh, please, no problem. Siri's always butting into my conversations. So I guess it's interesting because as a marketeer, I'm always obsessing about the data. And, we're constantly checking the pulse with consumers, the sentiment, how their values are evolving over time. I know everyone's talked about COVID till they're really sick of talking about it, but as a marketer, it's really driven an exponential change in the value system, in what consumers feel, how consumers feel, and when you put together with that the economic impact that COVID is going to continue to have, it's incredible. And as you continue to check in on the pulse and those insights, you start to see where the opportunity is to drive change or to connect with people about their passions. And one of the things that's really accelerated is purpose. And consumers' desire to choose brands because of what they stand for is at an all-time high. And it's not just at an all-time high as talk. They're really talking with their money and their wallets and where they're spending and using their spending power to hold people accountable. Particularly with Gen Z, it's table stakes that as an organization, you come with purpose. And you're not coming just with, I put my hand up, we're with you. You're coming with action that will drive impact. And that's the expectation of consumers today. And so just continuing to tap into those insights can guide you on that path. And I think that purpose is more important than ever. And as an organization, you need to have it from within the core of your business. What does it stand for? How do you want to support, drive societal change? And that is the passion of right now.
Can you give an example of something that has worked for you, that very specific?
Well, let's just talk about the Black Lives Matter movement that took place at the early part of COVID. You know, I'm a white woman from a different country, and my knowledge and experience of that in the US was very limited. Now I'm a lot more educated, and that process, that movement was so powerful for educating everybody, including me. And now we have, you know, as an organization, we have made a $500 million commitment in funds and actions to drive economic equity and opportunity for Black consumers, small businesses, and communities throughout the US. And that's a fully baked strategy within our organization now. So yeah, there's an example.
Excellent. Christina, you're in a unique position to evaluate and address consumer desires. How have the responses been to these efforts in the entertainment industry, and can you quantify the opportunity?
I'm going to answer a different question.
Okay.
Or speak to a bunch of different things, because there's so much
Yeah.
that's been said here that I'd love to find a way to respond to. In my previous life, I was on the other side of the table. I wasn't selling and making content. I was at a network. So, you know, I've seen a bunch of different things. And it's so interesting to hear the talk about purpose, and I think those things are really important. The other part of my job at the PA is that I was leading our brand partnerships team. So we work with brands to help match them up with players, to send messages out into the world. And it's a word that to me gets overused a lot, but authenticity has to go with purpose as well. And I think that's sometimes a little bit at odds. So, you know, one of the things that we're able to do with brands, you know, Naj talked about Target, right? So one of the things we're able to do with them is, how do you need to show up in the culture if you're going to be with this player? I mean, we had a very famous, you know, and I know this is being streamed, we had a very famous situation with Papa John's Pizza. And at the time, Papa John's wanted to, you know, do something with us, and that was sort of like, are you trying to blackwash this? Because they were not in a good place. They went and you know, did some other things, but it was like, we're not going to put our players in a position to be judged for that. So you need to have your authentic story, your authentic actions done before you can sort of claim some credit around that. And we can help you do that, and there are lots of people on the stage who can help you do that. So I think that's really important. I'm fascinated by this McKinsey study and all the things that you said, aside from the fact that I've experienced them personally, but also what I've seen in the world. And one of the things, and Daria and I were talking about this a little bit before, that I'm really worried about right now is that in times of financial crisis, this is the first thing to go.
Yep.
So how do we make sure that doesn't happen? Because everyone's excited and everyone wants to do things, and then it's like, ooh, the budget. People have to cut a lot of money from their budgets. So how do we make sure that these efforts are, yes, tied to economics? I've heard that argument many times in the past. So I think that's important, but I also think some things are just, these are really hard decisions to say, no, this is going to have to stay. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to continue to do this. And then when it comes to actually putting content out there in the world and what is the right kind of storytelling to do and what is the reaction to that, I think everybody here knows this as well. People react to things that are honest, that are a reflection of their lives, that are told truthfully. You know, and I think those things will never, ever change. But I also think it's important to, you know, all of these voices. You know, the great thing about, in many ways, the streaming world is that I can talk to a bunch of different people. I can tell a bunch of different stories. So let's make sure that we do tell a bunch of those different stories and not give up the commitment.
Thank you for that. Now I do want to talk about dollars and cents a little bit. Anna, why don't you talk about Sotheby's decision to expand the sale of Latin American art, and to what extent this was good financially?
So a little bit of background. From the beginning of Latin American art auctions, or the category, about 45 years ago, the way that both auction houses dealt with Latin American art in general was by having a separate sale of modern and contemporary art, usually scheduled 2 weeks after the key sales would take place, either Memorial Day weekend or Thanksgiving. Once, I always say, once everyone had left town and had spent enormous amounts of money on important purchases, then that would be the time that the Latin American art sale would have their preview exhibition and eventually their sales. For some time in the 80s, that model proved successful. That was very basic marketing to a region that was just beginning to come into terms with collecting art internationally. Back then, Mexican collectors would buy Mexican art. Brazilians would buy Brazilian art. Argentinians would buy Argentinian art. And there was very little exchange in terms of North Americans buying Latin American art in general, or even Europeans. So the idea that Latin American art belonged and that could be marketable and appreciated beyond Latin American borders was kind of, you know, a contradiction in terms almost. Fast forward to the 2000s, and even by the late 1990s, we started seeing a change. People were becoming more interested not just in the category, but also in visiting Latin America and learning more about artists and having a real cultural experience, not just one that, you know, took you to the same 3 or 4 places, and it was very much a high-end lifestyle experience of Mexico City or Sao Paulo. So looking for a true, authentic culture also became looking for genuine artists, and that translated into buying more and more art from the region in the United States. When we realized that also not just the category, but the potential to present great works beyond, you know, the geographic borders was important, and it was just talking about the data. It was all there. All the indicators were there. People were coming more to the key marquee sales in the earlier part of May and November than to ours. But the moment that they found out about ours a little bit, they would start buying and inquiring and getting more engaged. So we decided back in 2018 to do without the category itself, but still continue to source great works of art from this region into the modern and contemporary sales. And that meant presenting great works by Diego Rivera next to a Picasso, for example, or presenting Miro next to a Tamayo from Mexico, or having more of this curated approach to what could be a conversation between Latin American artists and European artists that had for decades basically just manipulated, the conversation completely without giving a lot of access to other regions or categories.
Interesting. I want to come back, Nadja, to this question of we have potentially a recession coming. Budgets are getting tighter. How do you, how do you ensure that this momentum that you see at Vice continues? How do you make sure that you don't slip backwards in terms of these efforts?
For us, it's part of our core strategy. You have to be absolutely relentless, because to Christina's point, it's the first thing that goes. The diversity budgets, first of all, the fact you call it diversity budget is a problem, because it's not diversity, it is business. And when someone starts it, well, this is for the diversity, I start by saying, oh, hold on, time out. If I do one more panel called this, I'm going to absolutely lose it, because it's just good business. How about this is part of your core business strategy, therefore this is why this is important? Why does it have to be differentiated or carved out of what you call DEI? The second you do that, it actually diminishes its significance and importance. How about it's just critical to your ability to reach this particular target audience? How about it's because when you look at the trends and culture of what truly leads culture, by marketing to this particular demographic, it actually leads to your ROI? How about that? But the second that things get tight, start to be carved away. And then when you then are left with are disingenuous, inauthentic efforts that I think diminish what was intended. So for me, you have to be deliberate, it has to be a core part of your strategy, and you have to be relentless in saying, I am going to make sure this is a priority for me. One of the things that, we've been doing at Vice is, we're sponsoring the Basquiat exhibit. And if you talk to Jean-Michel's sisters, what they talk about is their legacy. When this opportunity came across my desk at Vice, I was like, absolutely, because it's about the storytelling that Jean-Michel, even though he's no longer with us, is giving to a new generation. And for those of you who haven't seen the exhibit, go see it. You know what's going to be shocking? A lot of what he's talking about there is happening today. But now they're able to tell it with the help of us and some other sponsors to a whole new audience. That's an example of how you maintain and continue to push that rhetoric in the industry and around the table.
That's so interesting. Sheldon, in your opinion, what are industries doing right and doing wrong in this push for equity and inclusion? And I want to ask you specifically, you brought up these 40 different areas of, what are some things that can be done more urgently, even in a climate like we're saying, where the economy could be sliding backwards, where we can see progress more quickly?
Yeah, and I like what Nadja said. It can't be a side project or initiative. It has to be baked into how you operate. And I will say two things. One, it's really being serious about pursuing excellence. So I often use the example of college football. And the top elite college football programs, they pursue excellence. Mm-hmm. They'll find the best athletes wherever they are. If you look at the rosters, every rural town across all 50 states has a representation, because they are pursuing excellence to build the best program, to deliver the best product on the field, satisfy the alums, help with donations, what have you. So I do think this idea of it's not a side project that ebbs and flows, because we've seen it in the data, last in, first out. When there is kind of tightening, disruption, the folks who are last in goes out first. But I would say if you have a mindset around excellence and you say, there's got to be more, for example, black creative talent than I have, just mathematically, right? There's got to be. And you pursue that relentlessly as a business proposition, you'll get there. So that's point one. The second I would say is you have to be radical. And Nicola talked about this a little bit, 70% to get to 50. If you look at what Ava DuVernay has done with Queen Sugar, she said, look, I'm going to be radical. I'm going to have a slate of all female directors, right? And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said this too, she said 9 when somebody asked her, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? You have to be radical. So you don't disrupt a paradigm that's been calcified over centuries with incremental modest steps, right? So I would say if you pursue excellence because we believe the proposition is there, the talent is there, if you go find it, in the same way other professions in sports, for example, they've done it. They've gone to find the talent, and they've assumed that not all the best football players are in LA or New York. They've assumed that. And they say, well, let's go find them where they are. They're randomly distributed. And if you are serious and are willing to bend the curve with some radical moves that counter, radical patterns that have been baked in society and in systems over time, that's probably where I'd go.
I mean, most companies probably don't want to take such radical steps, don't you think?
Well, it depends on how serious you are.
Yeah. Nicola, what are the best practices to authentically identify and implement D&I across multiple markets internationally?
Well, the first thing is that I guess I've been fortunate enough to live in different countries. And so I think when you live in a different country, you really learn and feel the country. And one thing that stands true about all of my experience across the world is that there are no two countries who are the same, who have the same challenges or issues or needs to drive change. And usually they're very nuanced, and it's so important to really understand and determine the DNA, the cultural and societal circumstances that exist, and you need to build that bottom up. Then I think you have an opportunity to look at where there are commonalities across the world to drive consistency. I think where there is an opportunity is the process and the frameworks that you use can be very similar across the world. The outcomes will be slightly different. But first, it's really getting into the understanding the challenges that exist, why they exist, and what role you can then play as an organization to drive change in that ecosystem.
And you mentioned the changing patterns of Gen Z. To what extent is that going to force companies to perhaps start taking these kinds of radical approaches, whether they're ready to or not, in order to actually retain that?
Gen Z is so exciting and also a mind blow. This is a group of human beings who are refusing to identify as anything in particular. Fluidity is the world. Side hustles, careers, are they really, the way that they're looking at how they're going to earn their money is so completely different to the way we look at it today, that the opportunity to really transform the way the world works it's unbelievable with Gen Z. And I think that even in the work that I'm doing, I see the younger generation coming through, challenging the way we do things, and that's going to intensify. And I think that organizations, we all felt it as a result of COVID, have had to shift and bend and flex, because consumers and people now have a lot more power in speaking for what they believe is right and being able to live their lives in the way they want to live them. And that is only going to intensify as that next generation comes through. And watch out, because I think the world is going to look pretty different. I really do. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to just make a comment about that. We've done several reports on Gen Z, and Vice is fortunate to probably have a 85+% trust rating amongst this audience. I spent a lot of time with them. And let me tell you something, the audience is key. And oftentimes when we talked about the pushback, you can't argue with your audience. You can't argue with your audience. And this particular audience, Gen Z, and not talk about Gen Alpha right behind them, they are unwavering in their commitment to doing what's right. And as brand leaders, as representation on this panel, I can tell you, if you do not listen to them, they will walk away. and take everything with them. Doesn't matter all the efforts you have, they will walk away and start their own. And so it's time for us to start listening. And not just because the cameras are here, but because it makes sense. And I think I applaud your efforts, but that's really, that Gen Alpha, we thought Gen Z was alive. Whew. Let's talk about Gen Alpha. That's the next panel.
I want to hear what Christine has to say about that. I mean, you must be doing a lot of work.
I'm sure you're with them every day.
Yeah, you know, you are with them every day, and they really do have unbelievably high expectations. As you said, you know, you piss them off at your own peril, for sure. But the other thing that's really interesting is that they also don't need us to communicate with each other. I mean, like, this is the generation that is broadcasting themselves. Yeah. So, you know, that's a giant paradigm shift. So yes, we all need to, content creators, it's important for us to be reflective of them and tell their stories, but they're not waiting for that either. No. They got that.
Can you talk a little bit about one of your recent projects that you produced, Game Change Game, and what the reception of that has been?
I mean, I started in this role in content at the PA right before COVID started, and I had a very specific idea of what I thought I was going to do with content, and then ripped up everything and threw that out the window. And once COVID started, and obviously the league was in the crosshairs of, you know, the response to it, and the players obviously were a big part of this as well. We really saw there was an opportunity to tell a story in a very different way about from their perspective. And then George Floyd was murdered, and that changed everything. So the players, you know, really this is a film about race, about social justice, about the role of sports in all of that, and it's been an incredibly hard sell, and that's really disappointing. So in the wake of this 2020, these are the kind of stories that we want to hear and we want to tell. Not this one, though. And I think, you know, it's a hard truth in many ways. So, you know, I think it's been a bit more of a struggle than I would have hoped. But it's an incredibly powerful piece of filmmaking, and we're festivaling it and trying to figure out how to find the audience for it. The other thing that was really important to me is that, you know, as we've seen from an education perspective, and you know, it's a documentary, but it's not spinach, trust me. We're seeing such an attack on information and who gets to tell these stories. And I thought it was so critically important for the players to tell this story themselves, what role they played, places in which they fell short, places in which they succeeded. You know, we made this film for Gen Z, who doesn't get educated about the civil rights movement, who doesn't get educated about Tommie Smith at the Olympics, who doesn't really know anything but 5 years ago. So I think it's so critically important to make sure that these stories are out there in a way. We hired 2 young music video directors to do it because we really wanted it to look like something different. And, you know, as I said, it's a really proud moment, but it's been more of a struggle than I would have liked to bring it to a wider audience.
That's interesting. Anna, we talk a lot about representation in media, but there's less of a conversation about representation in art. So could you speak a little bit about the unique challenges in marketing contemporary Latin American art to collectors?
Well, I think the main challenge is education, right? I mean, you were talking about having the right content and the right access to that, but education for me is one of the things that I struggle the most when I'm talking to people, because I realize that for a long time, and this is in terms of art historical knowledge, very little was told about the art from the Americas, right? If you went to MoMA 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, you would probably find maybe 2 or 3 paintings hanging in the permanent collection exhibition. And that's not to say that they didn't have any. They had hundreds, but they just didn't show them. And they didn't show them because they thought, oh, you know, they didn't really belong, or they weren't that important, or they didn't fit into the narrative that MoMA and many other museums in the US kind of supported and advanced for more than 50 years. Not just in the museum world, but also academically. When I first started being specialist in this category, I remember that I didn't really have a lot of access to great literature, to great documentation of these artists. There were no great retrospectives or monographs or important shows at the Tate or at the Reina Sofia or in the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. It was basically starting from scratch. So you need to start putting together the history, right, in order to be able to narrate it and then communicate it and then actually teach a new generation of collectors, Americans, North Americans, Europeans, that this also existed at the same time. You just didn't get to know it. You just didn't get to read about it because no one took the time to present it to you in a way that made sense.
Interesting. So we have time for a couple of questions, and I'm going to just see who wants to answer these because they're not specified for a specific person. How do people who live outside of urban areas get their voices heard in front of these corporations? Are we being counted?
That's it. I mean, okay, so we have an active Gen Z survey and for everybody, so about 40 to 50,000 worldwide. So we're always listening, but for me, I have an open email policy. And I remember, this is a real story, and those that know me know I used to live in Africa. I got an email from someone in Botswana who was like, listen, I am starting an audio business and I don't know how to do this. And I know this is weird, but could you help me? And I connected him with our head of audio. And he's like, I can't believe you emailed me back. I'm like, well, why wouldn't I? So I think that there is something about listening. And remember, we talked earlier about making sure everyone is represented. Now, I didn't know this person in Botswana. And he probably took all of his energy to email me, hoping that I would actually respond, and I did. And he connected to our head of audio. Because sometimes being counted means simply responding and saying, I'll listen to you. I've got 10 minutes, go. Tell me how I can help. And so if you live outside of what one would call to be typical urban areas and you have a question, email one of us. Email someone and make sure that they listen to you. Oftentimes they will.
I really am not happy that we have to stop the conversation. We could go on and on, but I want to thank everyone for joining us for this incredible discussion. Thank you for taking the time. Please go to starstakethelead.com to learn more about STARS' efforts around diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.